Hi everybody, welcome to the video about efficiencies and market structure. And we're going to start out by looking at all of the graphs really that go along with monopoly. And we're going to, before we get to the graphs though, we're going to consider the larger question of efficiencies and monopoly. So I'm sure that you have all played the game Monopoly, as we see here. And I want you to think about all of the time it takes to play Monopoly. And so when they talk about efficiencies and monopolies, really what they're talking about is how much time worldwide has been taken up by the game of Monopoly and how inefficient that is. And just think about how many arguments that have been started because of the game of Monopoly. All of those things lead to inefficiencies. I know that in my own family, there is a legend of the day that my sister locked herself in the bathroom because she got so mad at my brother in Monopoly, and because she realized she was going to lose, and she refused to come out for about an hour and a half because she was so mad. And all of that goes back to how inefficient monopolies can be. Okay, obviously I'm kidding. That's not what we're going to talk about. But just keep it in mind. It's not completely out there. It's a way to remember that monopolies are inefficient because Monopoly takes so long to play. Okay, so to start, we're actually going to look first of all at the book, the graphs that are in the book. So we'll start with that. So again, this is the graph that you've seen before in the textbook if you did the reading for chapter 25. If you want to look at what it has in the textbook, this is on page 578 in the textbook. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the consumer and the producer surplus. And we're actually going to start with something that we went over last year just as a review, which is how this works in the market. And then from the market, we're going to go to the idea of the firm. So what you're going to see that I drew in here is the supply and demand curve that we're so used to seeing. But we want to remind ourselves of the concept of the consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus we're going to represent in red as it includes all of the points along the demand curve as well as all of the area below the demand curve down to the price that is being paid based on the equilibrium. So what we see here in red is the consumer surplus. So to remind you from last year what that's talking about is that all of these points represent different aspects and different people in the market demand. Somebody was willing to pay this price. Somebody was willing to pay this price. But because of the way the market works, all of those consumers that were willing and able to pay a higher price actually only have to pay the price that's set by the equilibrium point. So they get like a bonus. So this is the consumer surplus, meaning that they were willing and able to pay more because it represents greater utility for them, but then they only had to pay the market price. So the consumer surplus is all of the area underneath the demand curve down to the market price. Then we switch to the producer surplus. The producer surplus is drawn from the supply curve up to the market price, because this represents for the firm for the different firms who were willing and able to supply a price at a lower price. So in other words, there was a firm that said that they would supply the price that we're seeing here drawn in green, but they get to charge the price that's for the market. So in the market, all of these firms that were willing and able to charge a lower price actually get to charge the market price, and so that's considered to be the producer surplus. This is a concept we went over last year when we looked at supply and demand in the market, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to think about this in terms of what's happening for the monopoly, because we can also say that this graph that we're showing right here is the producer and consumer surplus in perfect competition. Because remember, the imperfect competition, the market price, right, that's set at equilibrium, is what sets the price in perfect competition. So the consumer surplus and the producer surplus happens in the market, and we also see it carried over into the perfectly competitive firm. Okay, so now we're going to look at the consumer and the producer surplus from the point of view of what does it mean, or how is it shown in the monopoly. So what we're going to show in the monopoly is the supply curve, which you'll notice in the book is kind of interestingly drawn as the marginal cost curve, because remember that for the we talked about how above the AVC the firm's marginal cost curve is the supply curve. So you can either draw this as marginal cost or you can draw that as supply. And then we have a demand curve. But the market, or the way that we drew this for the market and showed this as P1 and quantity 1, we're going to see that the monopolist does not charge price 1 and does not produce at Q1, because instead the thing that determines where they produce is the marginal revenue curve. So for the monopolist, if the marginal revenue curve hits the marginal cost curve here at quantity 2, that's going to be the quantity that they are producing. But then remember what we saw of how the monopolist sets its price. They go up to the demand curve, and then they set a price that is as high as the demand curve will support, which is higher than the price would have been in perfect competition, and it's well above where MC equals MR. So we're going to continue here with the same idea of showing the consumer surplus, which is the same idea of the demand curve down to the price that the consumer is paying. So what we see here is this part right here represents the consumer surplus. It's the same concept. It's the price they're paying below the demand curve. And then what has happened is the producer surplus has gotten much larger. So we're going to now draw in the producer surplus. So the producer surplus is from the supply curve, which is represented by the marginal cost curve, up to the price that the firm is receiving. So what we're seeing in purple here is the producer surplus. So part that would have been the consumer surplus in perfect competition, which I'm going to now put some lines through. This part right here, I'm coloring it purple because it's part of the producer surplus, but in perfect competition, that box where the lines are going both directions, that would have been part of the consumer surplus. Now, the monopolist charges price 2 and produces at quantity 2. So that gives us a whole nother thing here, which is that they're not producing at quantity 1, right? They've decreased their quantity and they have increased the price that they're charging. So what we have here in this area, in the little triangle, is something that we looked at when we talked about market failure, which is is called dead weight loss. And this is the dead weight loss of a monopoly. Sorry. Okay, so so what we're seeing here on the graph is that the reason why this is called a dead weight loss is that nobody's getting that benefit because the quantity is not being produced.